and it's been really great so far. This is month number 2. My name is Jennifer Nelson, and I lead the front end team at Quanalytics, and been organizing this meetup for a few years now. But this is put on by BASE, which is Birmingham, Alabama Software Enthusiast, and this organization, I like to think of it like a framework for meetups almost, that it helps you kind of jumpstart if you have an idea for an event series or just a one-off event that you want to organize, but you don't want to go through all of the trouble of setting it up and trying to promote it and find sponsors and things like that. Let us know. So that's what BASE is here for, to provide a way for people to jump in and lead and organize little groups so that we can build community and share knowledge. So these lunch and learns have been a part of that BASE structure. And that's how I got involved in BASE, was through the React Lunch and Learn. And so it's been really helpful, and gotten to meet a lot of people and learn from a lot of you here in the Birmingham community. So this front-end essentials lunch and learn, the goal is to focus on JavaScript, CSS, HTML, all the things that are fundamental to us as front-end web developers. And that's becoming larger and larger. What is that role of the front-end developer? I like kind of focusing on CSS. And so as we're thinking about future front-end essential lunch and learns, if you have something to share, or if David inspires you and makes you think of something that goes along with this topic that you would like to share about, let me know. I'd love to kind of theme these next few months around CSS, and if we can, just to keep the topic going and focused. But I'm open to anything related to those essentials. So I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. I'm so excited to have David Lormor here. David is somebody who is just instrumental in building BASE and organizing and kind of unifying the Birmingham developer community. He's recently moved to Dallas, but he was gracious enough to speak with us today. Still has big heart for the Birmingham community, and you'll see him pop in on the Magic City Tech Slack a good bit. So so appreciative of him being willing to share his knowledge. So David currently serves as the CTO of Wyndy, and I'll let him tell you a little bit more, but he is going to talk today just all about CSS architecture, and really looking forward to hearing from him. We are recording this talk, and I'll post that link in Magic City Tech Slack and send it out on Meetup, but we have a YouTube channel with all of our talks, so you can go there to listen to past talks as well. So thanks so much, and thank you to Trend Micro for sponsoring. We'll hear from them at the end. Justin Nelson is here today with Trend Micro, and if you think of a great question to ask, you can win a $25 gift card, Uber Eats gift card. So think of some good questions, and we'll take time for those at the end. So without further ado, David, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Like I was mentioning, this is my first time with Microsoft Teams. So give me just a second here while I get hopefully get the right screen shared and everything. Y'all able to see my presentation here? You good?
Yeah.
All right. Good. Awesome. So like I said, first off, thanks to Jennifer and BASE and everybody who's in attendance for making this happen today. Little fun fact, I was the organizer that originally put together these React Lunch and Learns after a lot of coaxing from the community. And then as things started to get busy for me, Jennifer stepped up and took the reins and has been doing an awesome job ever since, and has taken on a pretty instrumental role in just kind of keeping the BASE torch going, especially since I moved to Texas in the middle of last year. But like she said, my company that I work for is still based in Birmingham, and I really owe a ton to the Birmingham tech community for getting me where I am today. So I love coming back and kind of being a part of these things. And hopefully after COVID's all done, we'll get a chance to get together and grab lunch or a beer sometime soon. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and dive in here. I hope I haven't oversold myself with the name for this talk and getting super creative. Hopefully it's interesting and whatnot. But I've entitled this talk Zen and the Art of Cascading Style Sheets, an Inquiry into Values. For those of you that caught the reference there, this is sort of an allusion to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book written by Robert Pirsig back in 1974. It was generally well received as a work of kind of pop philosophy. More serious philosophers tend to deride the book just a bit, but it follows a father and son on a cross-country motorcycle trip as they explore a variety of kind of philosophical concepts, one of which is sort of this idea of like the romantic versus the classical or classic viewpoint. The romantic viewpoint being this sort of like living in the moment, not really worried about rational analysis, just kind of doing your thing type of approach to life. While the classic viewpoint is more sort of focused on knowing all the details and understanding the inner workings of things and mastering mechanics. And this plays out as this father and son go on their trip, and there's like a group of folks that are the romantics that are just like, they got their motorcycles and they're going and they're having fun and they're not really worried about how it works. They're just there for the ride. And the classic viewpoint folks are more kind of focused on this idea of motorcycle maintenance and like understanding when the motorcycle sounds funny, what's going on, and how do I like dig in and sort of tweak my tools and whatnot to make them work for me. And so corny analogy possibly, but I skipped a slide here. Basically, I sort of saw an analogy here with this talk in terms of Zen and the Art of Cascading Style Sheets. And basically what I want to explore in this was based on a discussion that started on the Magic City Tech Slack channel, but really dive into this idea of semantic versus utility-based approaches to CSS architecture. And like the author in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he ultimately tries to sort of seek a balance between the two viewpoints. We'll try to seek a balance between each viewpoint and see where each might be valuable or applicable. So a little bit about me. Like Jennifer mentioned, I am the CTO at Wyndy. I was previously senior front-end engineer at Theranest, as well as an interactive developer at Cayenne Creative, and kind of got my start as a full-stack developer at a state agency called AIDT there in Alabama. But I've been tinkering since CSS, tinkering with CSS since 2001 when I first signed up for a webmastering class in high school. For you OG folks that remember when we used to call this thing webmastering versus web development or software engineering or whatever. That was the sort of term to art when I first got exposed to this. But I really kind of came of age, so to speak, during the CSS3 renaissance of the like early 2010s, where the standards bodies and folks driving browser standards really started to focus on improving both CSS and JavaScript to make them more of a robust environment for building applications and whatnot, and not just pretty web pages. I've worked on a variety of projects over the years, and so I've got quite a bit of hands-on experience in a lot of different tools and techniques, and seeing the pros and cons of each way of doing it. And so hopefully I can provide some insights, at least from my personal experience, into kind of what works and what doesn't work in that regard. So, sorry, I should mute my phone. So before we dive into that, I first wanted to take everybody back to basics and talk about vanilla CSS, because I don't think any of these concepts really matter if we don't have a solid understanding of the fundamentals of CSS. So I have this figure here. It's completely made up by myself, personal experience, but from what I've seen, 93% of all developers I've ever worked with are just absolutely terrified to touch raw CSS with a 10-foot pole. It's sort of the redhead stepchild, so to speak, of programming. And I think somewhat for good reason. As we dive in here, it's sort of a quirky. It's not really a programming language, but you can do programming-ish things, and so it's really, in some regards, it requires a different mindset than your just standard kind of functional or object-oriented approach to solving more, at the end of the day, sort of more mathematical, algorithmic type of problems. So that being said, CSS really is not that hard when you understand what concepts are important to understand. And this is not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the concepts that over the years I've found valuable, that I sort of touch on a day-to-day basis and need to be fluent in to be able to understand some of the more complex styling concerns and whatnot that you may run into for specific use cases. But some of the highlights here are selector logic, which is just understanding how to select a class versus using your greater than sign to select like direct child elements. This is like first child selectors and attribute selectors and things like that. Just understanding that is applicable definitely on the CSS side for scoping your styles, but also in general with JavaScript too. If you're not necessarily using a framework like React, you are going to have to dive into that at some point to add functionality to various parts of or various elements in your markup. In addition to that, knowing how the box model works and just the various parts of kind of sizing and shaping your elements on the page, as well as positioning. And two things that I think go a really long way towards a lot of what people end up reaching to a framework or a particular utility is flexbox layouts and grid layouts. So people tend to just try to find something off the shelf to handle these concerns, but with a little bit of research and knowledge, a lot of that you can replace with just the raw out-of-the-box tools that are in the browser. So I'd highly recommend, if you look at this list and there's anything you don't feel comfortable with, go get comfortable with those things, and you may realize that some of the utilities and frameworks that are out there really, not that necessary to do some of the things that you may be trying to do in your projects. So that being said, while there's plenty that CSS can do, there's definitely reasons why CSS sucks. In particular, it is hard to manage the cascade and encapsulate styling, especially when we're talking about the way raw CSS works. It requires you to write a lot of repetitive selector logic and repetitive styles to get what you need done. And there's a lack of logic to utilize things like variables, loops, and we'll call them functions, to be able to sort of group your styles and sort of better create a hierarchy of elements and other things like that. So at the end of the day, it's great for output because it keeps the end product of CSS very simple. It's not great for input and kind of creating the styles that we want. So how do we make CSS suck less, or how have we made CSS suck less in the past? So there's a variety of tools and techniques that have arisen over the years to help tackle some of this. One of the sort of essential things that most people reach for here, regardless of what other frameworks or utilities they use, are pre and post processors. So I assume most folks are familiar with at least one of these. You have Sass and SCSS, which is Sassy CSS, which is sort of a limited subset of Sass with a little bit less functionality. There's Less, which is a JavaScript-based CSS preprocessor. There's also Stylus, which was on the rise to be a competitor to some of these in the mid-2010s, but I haven't really seen much of anybody that's used that lately. And then Post CSS is one that's risen in popularity in recent years as part of the kind of popular JavaScript tool chains that have risen up around things like Webpack and Rollup. It kind of integrates with some of those tools a little bit better than say Sass, for example. But really, most of these tools are pretty flexible in terms of being able to be implemented in a variety of environments. We also have utilities and utility-first frameworks, and this is one of the core concepts in the talk as we dive in a little bit more. Over the past few years, this is a concept that's risen in popularity quite a bit in terms of being a quote-unquote easier or simpler approach to CSS, and it's not without merit, but we'll get into some of the trade-offs and whatnot here in just a minute. But some of the examples of this are CSS modules, which is a thing that has been proposed as part of the eventual CSS core sort of functionality. I don't know where its status is at, but definitely kind of was rising in popularity a few years ago, and then I think has kind of been superseded by some of these other techniques. Bourbon is a personal favorite of mine, both as a drink as well as a utility. It's not very widely used or well known, but it's a nice way to get some of the like cross-browser compatibility features you need into your app without adding a lot of the other cruft that other tools and frameworks tend to bring into your code base. And then ultimately, the sort of leader in this sort of utility-first approach these days is Tailwind CSS. It's gained significant popularity in the past couple of years and has sort of spun the approach most people have taken to CSS on its head, and we'll dive into a little bit of what that looks like and why it's popular here in a minute. And then Tachyons is another one. It seems to not be quite as popular as Tailwind, but takes a sort of similar approach to CSS classes. And then we have what I think a lot of people tend to be familiar with, which are your traditional kind of component-based frameworks. These things seek to provide a sort of generic set of styled components that you can use and sort of weave together in your user interfaces. There's, as with all things, there's trade-offs to using these, but Bootstrap is by far one of the most popular, well-known frameworks in this regard. But you've also got Foundation, Semantic UI, Bulma is a newer sort of up-and-comer, and then I also included Material UI in here. I have a footnote here about don't get me started on why Material UI is not a framework. There are 1,000 frameworks that have popped up claiming to be quote-unquote Material UI. But at the end of the day, in its original form, material design was more of a set of guidelines around how to craft user interfaces, which I'll get into in a minute. but there are plenty of libraries out there if you want to have a material UI look and feel to your applications. There's also a level sort of beyond this that I tend to call UIKits, and this provides a wide variety of very sort of dynamic sort of next level of components for your application, things like calendars and really fancy sort of table frameworks and whatnot, where you can essentially build spreadsheets in the browser and whatnot, as well as more robust sort of tools to build out dashboards and things like that quickly and easily. So there's a few of these here, and most of these tend to get away from the sort of open source approach and more into the world of kind of paid proprietary software. But depending on your use case, they can be a great fit. And then finally, the other sort of thing I wanted to call out here are what I refer to as architecture / kind of styling guides. The three sort of popular ones in this regard. The first two are BIM or Beam and SMAX or SMAX. And they basically, while they don't necessarily provide you with any sort of tooling, they're more of sort of a guide for how to structure your CSS in an organized fashion, especially as your code base grows. Beam is more of a flat hierarchy. It's more sort of in line with utility type libraries in terms of trying to basically avoid the cascade of CSS and explicitly style each component and reduce the coupling between your parent-child relationships and your sibling relationships. SMAX is more of it more leans into the cascade that you get with CSS and takes advantage of the parent-child and sibling relationships that you have in your element hierarchy. This can be challenging to do in vanilla CSS, but with some of the basic, just out of the box pre or post processing tools like Sass, Less, or Post CSS, you can implement a SMAX style architecture pretty simply without having to handwrite a lot of the sort of hierarchy that your styles requires. And then I included, Material UI in this guide as well. Like I said, I tend to look at Material UI as a set of kind of recommendations and best practices around crafting intuitive, rich user experiences versus what it sort of evolved into, which is just like a standard set of styles to make your app look like it was built by Google at the end of the day. So that's my take on those. I forgot to mention at the beginning of this, if at any point anybody has questions, I hate talking for 45 minutes straight, so feel free to jump in with questions, or I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well if you want to drop a question in there, and I will try to keep an eye on that and answer anything as it comes up. There's quite a bit to cover here, and so I'm trying to just kind of hit the macro level versus diving really deep into any of these tools. Each of these tools could be, a whole series of presentations on their own, and we're really just looking at like the trade-offs between the high level here. So jumping in from here, what we really are diving into is what I've dubbed the CSS Architecture Wars. This is this concept of utility-based or utility-first frameworks versus component-based or semantic-style frameworks or architectures. So we'll start with the utility-based frameworks, which are sort of the new hotness these days. they tend to prefer structure and style all in your HTML. So I don't know. My guess is this is potentially somewhat influenced by things like React that have taken some of your some of the separation of HTML and JavaScript and whatnot and combined it all into one place in your JavaScript. And in my mind, these utility-based frameworks have tried to take away the interaction with your CSS files out of the picture, and you just write HTML basically. So like I said, examples of this include Tailwind and Tachyons, as well as some of the more component-based libraries like Bootstrap and Semantic also have utility components to their libraries for things like positioning and layout and grids and things like that. To jump over real quick, I wanted to share an example of what this looks like. Make my screen a little bigger here. So this is taken from the Tailwind CSS documentation here. It's their example of how to make this little chit chat button here. So it's like a little notification thing. And you can see here the utility-based approach to CSS classes. We've got a ton of very explicit classes that explain the styling for that particular element. So looking at this, I don't know that this div here is a container for the chit chat notification bubble or whatever it is. I just know that it's got this set of styles applied to it. So on the one hand, it makes it very easy to sort of tweak your styles all in one place and quickly sort of iterate on how that particular element looks. But then we'll get into some of the trade-offs here in a minute. Sorry, next slide. There we go. So looking at what some of the pros and cons to these types of frameworks are, on the pros, it's easy to learn in digestible chunks. So I don't need to understand some sort of complex API surface for some component to apply some basic styles to my project. If I know that I just want, some rounded corners on my button, I go find the rounded corner class and I drop it into my HTML. I don't even need to worry about opening up a CSS file. I can just get moving quickly. It also allows for a level of composability that you're usually not going to see in more component-based frameworks. So if I want to swap out the styles between two different buttons or add, say, a particular state on hover, all I have to do is switch out my classes. So it's fairly straightforward and composable in that way. And while this is sort of a shared pro with component-based frameworks, it's going to take care of a lot of the cross-browser concerns that you can have, as well as legacy browser concerns around, crazy stuff like Internet Explorer support. If that's something you still need to worry about, you'll usually get that out of the box with a lot of these frameworks. On the con side of things, utility-based frameworks, in my opinion, don't effectively express the concerns, concepts, or developer intent in your code. So when I look at this piece of code here, this piece of markup, I have, without looking at what's actually displayed on the screen, I can't at a glance tell you what the heck this element is supposed to be. I can probably read through this and give you a guess as to what it's going to look like, but I don't know if the developer intended for this to be a notification bubble or a flash message on the top of the screen or a menu item. It doesn't tell me anything about that. So that's one of the trade-offs. Also, this can become very unwieldy as complexity grows. So as your app gets larger and larger, if you've copied and pasted these styles to, 10 different elements across your application that are all supposed to be the same element, it's going to be a pain if all of a sudden we want the background to be red on these. I need to go to all the different places in my application where I've implemented this little text bubble and change it to background red, and swap out my classes there. Whoops. It also becomes reliant on external mechanisms to scale. So a lot of the recommendations when you dive into like the Tailwind CSS framework, for example, is that the way to encapsulate these styles and whatnot is to use a framework like React to get that sort of component description into your code base. But now you're bringing in this third-party dependency to make this utility-based framework scale. There's other ways you can tackle this. One other technique that's recommended is the use of @apply. Sorry, my text messages are going crazy here. 1 second. Turn that off. Using @apply within your CSS is a way to apply these classes to some sort of more descriptive component-based class, but you can run into issues here as you're mixing @apply classes in your CSS with HTML-based classes. Knowing where particular styles are coming from can become opaque. And then finally, overriding the built-in classes, which is, recommended you don't do, but we all know you get in a rush to finish some piece of a project, and it's like, well, I've got this, whatever MX auto class. I'll add some other concern. I'll just select that class and add, my red background to it. And now you have this meaningless or overloaded concept in your system that now does more than what the framework you're using intended. So my little blurb here is that inheritance and composition are good and monkey patching is bad. So in general, that's more of a developer discipline concept than anything, but it's something that can trip us up in unexpected ways in a utility-based framework. I think I forgot to mention earlier, my bias towards semantic-based approaches is probably coming through already, but just to make that explicit, I definitely have a bias towards the semantic side of things, but definitely understand the trade-offs and where a more utility-focused approach may be valuable. On the semantic side of things, I basically consider this HTML and CSS, quote unquote, as God intended. God here being the browser standards folks that, explicitly made the decision to keep HTML focused on your document structure, while CSS is focused on your document styling. And what this means in practice, I think people hear this term sometimes, but don't really, concretely understand what that means. In my mind, we're basically stating that our HTML should be responsible for expressing the parent-child and sibling relationships between our different elements. That hierarchy that you see, your little kind of V shape of elements in the code, or markup rather. And then identifying and classifying your elements. So this is your IDs and classes. And I tend to think about this in sort of an object-oriented programming way. So classes are similar to your classes and your objects in an object-oriented environment. And then IDs are not utilized as much in HTML, but this is sort of a way to express a similar concept of a specific instance of some sort of element on your screen. So pros and cons of semantic frameworks and approaches. On the pros side, the semantic frameworks tend to be more scalable. because elements are classified according to their intent and state versus just the raw styling, you can change your styles in one place to express that change across a variety of elements and code. We're essentially drying up our styles by using a more semantic-based approach. It can also be more expressive. Your developer intent and your system concepts become clear when you're taking a semantic approach to things. And then they can also be self-contained. Going back to the utility frameworks where you may need more of an external mechanism, such as React or Vue or something like that, to encapsulate a particular quote-unquote component. With the semantic-based approach, it's just your HTML and CSS that you're using to create those components, so to speak. I also just realized I forgot to dive into what the semantic approach looks like. So we looked at the Tailwind approach to this chit chat button that they've got. They also have a nice little example of this chit chat button in the traditional approach. They've got a little X here implying this is bad. I would argue that it's not. And there's a lot of pros to the markup we see here. Obviously, there's some more kind of custom code involved in that, but there are ways to mitigate some of this. But if we look at this output here, I have no idea what this button is going to look like in my HTML or my markup here, but it's very easy to look at this and understand that this thing is somehow tied to chat and it's a notification. There's some sort of logo in it. It's got some content that includes a title and a message. And to me, as a developer that wants to understand the intent of the people who wrote this code before me, before I go changing things, this makes it very clear what each element on the screen is supposed to represent. And then my styles are all expressed separately in the CSS. And I think the folks in the Tailwind camp would argue, this is going to sound demeaning, I don't mean it this way, but that this is all very complex and kind of scary, and developers don't want to deal with that. But like I said in the beginning, I'm confident that each and every one of you, with a little bit of diving into how to do this stuff, will realize it's really pretty simple and straightforward to do this stuff yourself. So that's what the semantic approach looks like, though. So the downsides to a semantic approach, this one is actually a big one. I'm only half being sarcastic here, but developers have to talk to each other in a semantic approach so that you can agree upon what the concepts in your system mean. So, we have to talk about what is a chat notification, should it have a logo, and things like that, and come to consensus in understanding the concepts in our system. That can be intimidating to some folks. Sorry, I keep doing that. But in the long run, it's, I think, a healthy thing, even if it pulls some of us outside of our comfort zone to do so. It's also slower to implement, and can frankly be even dangerous to implement something like this too soon. If you don't know the concepts up front, taking a utility-based approach until those concepts become clear is actually a valuable way to approach building out your system and your architecture. I don't know how many folks have experienced this, but early abstraction of a concept can really be painful to undo if you get that abstraction wrong. So there's a little bit more of a slow, methodical approach required to effectively implement a more semantic architecture to your CSS. And along those lines, abstraction has a cost, just in terms of the learning curve, working across multiple development files, helping or coming to a shared understanding of what particular concepts mean. So it's not without cost. I would argue that the cost in certain systems is well worth it, though. So at the end of the day, though, utility versus semantic classes is just the same age-old argument we've been having for years around declarative versus imperative code. So I'm sure we've all heard that. I don't know if we all know what it means, but I figure diving into this is really the root of what this argument is all about. Not that it's an argument that there's a winner or a loser, but that's what the trade-off that we're looking at is here. So in the way I've sort of broken this down is that utility classes are more aligned with an imperative style of coding, or what I'll call imperative markup. For those that don't know what that means, it's one of these big sort of programmery terms that folks like to throw around in computer science departments and whatnot. Imperative, the dictionary definition of that is giving an authoritative command. How we think about that in programming terms is that we're being explicit about the functionality and telling the computer how to perform some function. So we typically see this in more procedural type code. So when you have a big block of for loops and conditionals and while loops, things like that, that is imperative procedural code. So we're telling the computer exactly how it's going to process a set of instructions. On the same spectrum, when we look at CSS, if we're looking at CSS classes that tell the HTML element how it's styled. So these utility classes in Tailwind are very imperative in their nature of telling the HTML how it should look. And this is not always a bad thing. Every single system you ever work with is going to have some imperative code. It may have lots of imperative code, just depending on the needs and how the team has approached things. Imperative code tends to be kind of easier to understand in some ways. Everything's all in one place. It can also, for certain requirements, be more performant as well, because the computer's not having to pull together as many different resources to sort of reconstruct the functionality that you're trying to express. On the other side of things, we have semantic classes, which I will call declarative markup. Declarative, or declaring something, is the formal announcement of a state or condition. And so what this means as far as our code and our CSS classes are concerned is that it's going to be more implicit. We're telling the computer what something is or what we want versus asking or explaining how the computer should do that. So this is what we strive for a lot of times when we're trying to write functional or object-oriented code. It relies heavily on abstraction and encapsulation, which are two other computer sciencey terms that, for me, it took me 10 or 15 years to really grasp what this meant and get over, once again, the fear of what is this crazy concept my professors are talking about and whatnot. And at the end of the day, just understanding that it's essentially how you organize your code and keep that code isolated to only affect itself versus the other code or functionality that's running around it. So examples of this are like React components. React describes itself as a declarative JavaScript framework. We're building up a set of components, whether that be buttons or text boxes or whatever. And as we compose those components together, we're not necessarily telling the system how those components work. We're just saying that we want these components to be together. It's also where you see the more descriptive kind of class names. So going back to our example here, this is a much more declarative class name system describing these elements. We know this is all a chat-based system, and we're looking at some sort of notification here without even seeing what the actual end product is. So in my personal opinion, every system should strive to expose declarative concepts as a means to express intent, reduce repetition, and encapsulate logic. And I believe as your team grows, while this may increase the learning curve for new developers, it ultimately leads to building a shared understanding across the team of what the different concepts in your system are. So as we kind of wind things down here, whoops, I hate to like read this long quote, but it just spoke to me when I found this. This is a quote from Jeffrey Zeldman, who's the creative director at Automatic, which is the company that makes WordPress. He's also the co-founder of A List Apart and Event Apart, as well as he's been dubbed the King of Web Standards by Bloomberg Businessweek. So clearly a very well-respected, credentialed person. He wrote a blog article back in 2017 called Kiss My Class Name, where he stated that I believe the problem, and this is in regards to utility-based CSS frameworks rising in popularity, said, I believe the problem is a dozen people working on something without talking to each other. Slapping a visually named class on every item in your markup may indeed make your HTML easier to understand for a future developer who takes over without talking to you, especially if you don't document your work and create a style guide. But making things easier for yourself and other developers is not your job. And if you want to make things easier for yourself and other developers, talk to them and create a style guide or a pattern library. The code base on big sites isn't impenetrable because developers slavishly followed arbitrary best practices. The code base is broken because developers don't talk to each other and don't make style guides or pattern libraries. And they don't do these things because the people who hire them force them to work faster instead of better. It starts at the top. So employers who value quality in CSS and markup will insist that their employees communicate, think through long-term implications, and document their work. Employers who see developers and designers as interchangeable commodities will hurry their work along, resulting in bloated code bases that lead intelligent people to blame best practices instead of work processes. The present is always compromised, always rushed. We muddle through with half the information we need, praised for our speed and faulted when we stop to contemplate or even breathe. Frameworks built on newish worst practices seem like the way out, but they end up teaching and permanently ingraining bad habits in a generation of web makers. Semantics, accessibility, and clarity matter. Reusability is not out of reach. All it takes is clarity and communication. So that like I felt like that encompassed my approach and my thoughts about all this better than I could state myself. So I'm going to plagiarize him and use that. But I think it's also important to call out, this is not just on you guys as individual developers to enforce this. It's really on your leadership. And if you are a leader of your team, providing that space for your developers to think about the systems that they're building and encapsulate or encode those concepts into the system and create the documentation and the libraries to empower their teams to understand that. So that takes work. It's not always something that that we have the luxury of having the time to do, but when we're striving to do something right, I think it's the right way to go. So what now? So first off, just to reiterate, go back to the basics. If the thought of having to align some items or vertically align some items on the page terrifies you, if you don't know the difference between absolute or relative positioning, if you don't quite understand the box model, like start there. It's honestly not that hard, and you will be better off for it, and you will more effectively understand the trade-offs you're making when you go to reach for a utility-based or a component-based framework. And then from there, understand your use case. So is this a quick rush project? Is this, is this a product I'm going to be building for the next 5 years? How much money do I have? Is this, is there a team involved? Understand all that. Next is always be refactoring. Like I mentioned, component-based frameworks and semantic CSS classes don't just breathe themselves into existence. They take time and learning from working with your system and interacting with it. So as those concepts get exposed, that's when you take the time to encapsulate them into classes and frameworks and libraries. Also, give yourself a break. This stuff is really hard. The demand for more dynamic UIs is increasing every single day, and we want them faster. Somebody's always moving faster than us, and we're being told we need to catch up with, some other company or team or person or whatever, and the tooling is only getting more complex. Jennifer alluded to this at the beginning, but the front end world has exploded, and I've been telling people for 5 years that like the idea of the front end architect is not far off from where we are at this point. Something that was usually relegated to the folks that weave all these complex systems together on the back end and spin up servers and do crazy stuff. We're doing that same type of work on the front end, even if it's not in the same sort of tech space. Our tools require a broad set of knowledge to get them to work together. So at the end of the day, find what makes you and your team happy and effective, and run with that. Don't feel like because I said anything in this talk, or because you read an article and they said Tailwind was the best or Bootstrap was the best, don't feel like you have to do that if it doesn't work with the way you and your team's brain works. And along those lines, talk to your team. If you have a team. If it's just you, talk to yourself. Think about, what do I want to achieve from this system? If you have a team, talk to them to see like what are their goals, what are their preferences as far as utility-based frameworks or more semantic CSS, and understand why. Don't just accept, well, this blog article said we should do it this way. Work with your team to understand what the needs of your system are. So just to wrap things up here and share my personal preference, this is, like I said, don't do this just because this is how I do it, but kind of closing things out with some strong opinions here. When it comes to more product-oriented projects, where there's going to be a lot of custom branding and elements involved, as always, I'm going to take an iterative approach and start small. I'm not going to try and build an entire UI library before we've even built the first screen. So I'm going to work iteratively. I tend to take a component-driven approach. These days I use React. I've used Ember and Angular in the past, and I still hold out hope that one day web components will just be part of the browser, and we'll all just use that to use the native functionality to express these concepts in our systems. I prefer, obviously, the semantic CSS approach. I tend to use Sass plus Smax as sort of my guide to architecting those systems, and then working with a good UI designer. I know enough design concepts to be dangerous, but having, if you're really working on a long-term, large-scale product, having somebody that can do a lot of the creative thinking, we'll call it, and allow me to focus on building the code to support that is valuable. It allows me to delegate a lot of the stylistic thinking to somebody else. For your enterprise consulting and exploratory projects, so like just personal projects and whatnot, basically anywhere where like custom branding is not a key requirement in that system, go out and pick an actively maintained right-sized library. Obviously talk to your team, but like, you know, whether it's Tailwind, Bootstrap, Kendo UI, you know, find something that's going to allow your team to move fast and deliver the right level of abstraction for your needs, and go from there. And I think I'm almost to the end here. A little bit of prior art, links to some articles and whatnot. I'll try to get these slides shared as well, so y'all can read these links and stuff. And then I have to give a special shout out to my buddy Billy, that inspired me to overcome my fear of CSS. I was a Bootstrap aficionado, and all my designs looked like they were just Bootstrap example designs from like the Bootstrap website. And he helped me get into the basics of CSS and realize that it wasn't that hard, and I could make really cool custom styled sites and apps myself without a whole lot of work. And that's it. So realize we're at 1 o'clock. I don't know if anybody has any questions or if we have time for that, but appreciate y'all taking the time to listen to me ramble today.
David, thanks so much. I know that we're out of time, so I wanted to, there were a few questions. I posted the link to Magic City Tech Slack. That's a great place to continue this conversation, to discuss these questions. There's some really good ones. There's a lot to think about and simmer on here. I know my team, we've got a 1 o'clock meeting, so we got to jump off soon. But I'll leave it up and let Justin talk a little bit about Trend Micro. And David, I don't know about your timeline, but you can let them know how much time you have for questions if you'd like. But thanks so much for everybody for being here, and do jump on Magic City Tech Slack to continue the conversation.
Hey, yeah, I'm Justin with Trend Micro. I've got a hard stop at 1 as well. We're awesome. We do a lot for cloud security, shifting left to the developers. So check out that link I put in the chat. And next 2 people that put their email addresses in get the last 2 Uber Eats. So do that really fast.
Awesome. Well, thanks, y'all. Like Jennifer said, find us on Magic City Tech Slack if you're not already on there. If I can grab a copy of these questions real quick, and if y'all are on there, I'll be happy to answer those questions and keep the discussion going there. So thanks, y'all.
And I'll send out David's slideshow, and I'll get with him and get that and post the video. So see y'all next month. Thanks so much.
And Hunter, you're disqualified for using that awful hey.
Oh, come on.
Wow. You muted yourself so I didn't have to hear your terrible opinion.
All right, see you guys.
This whole thing's frozen.